You know, Jacob, I was going to call this one Nobody Really Cares for the Trees or Nobody Really Cares for the Woods anymore, but maybe I should just rename it to Jacob Doesn't Really Care for the Trees because you keep putting this episode off. And then when it finally comes time, oh, fine, let's do it.
I just thought that this was your marijuana episode.
Oh,
You just keep just throwing out there, let's talk about trees. And it's like, geez, Mike, you got to keep your personal proclivities like off of this platform, you know? But if you insist.
We hear what we want to hear. Yeah.
Oh, nice. I like how you turn that around on me.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
So welcome everybody to this episode of the Voyage podcast where, as Jacob and I were just kind of talking about, we are going to be talking about the trees, just the kind of general tree element that you see in so much of mythology. Obviously not just the pagan mythology of especially like Norse or Greek mythology, but then even the, dare we say it, mythology or mythological presence of trees in the Bible. And what is the theological significance to that? And then where do we see it pop up in kind of our more modern myths, things like that. So this is going to be, and if we happen to focus on maybe some specific trees that Jacob has in mind or was thinking about, then so be it. But yeah,
this is going to be our Aldous Huxley, because back when we last talked about him, I can't remember the name of his book, but it's Doors of Perception.
Okay.
This is going to be we're going to talk about magic mushrooms. We're going to talk, no, I'm just kidding. We're not talking about hallucinogenics.
Well, actually, so
in today's episode.
It's funny
Mike?
You bring that up because, so when we just kind of wanted to talk about some of the general things about trees and why they've been so prevalent, because they are so prevalent in all of culture's mythologies. And you brought up, but
sure,
they do have a special connection to mushrooms. I mean, not just the fact that like you'll see them growing on trees or whatever, but that they have a role in the growth of trees or but then we've had conversations about the Last of Us show, which is the kind of, if you want to,
mushrooms play a role.
If you want to call
show,
it the zombie apocalypse, but it uses mushrooms, they have a role in the.
What if it was all in their head, Mike? What if at the end of the series,
like they just wake up and
Joel wakes up and it's the first, and it's his daughter is there, and it's back in Texas.
And he was tripping on.
And it was all.
Yeah, it was even better than just a dream.
He was tripping on shrooms that his brother brought to him. Yes. Man, that would be a heck of a twist. That would be
so disappointing. if that's what you mean by twist, then
we don't know how the video game series hasn't finished its third installment.
Oh,
it could
is there
technically still?
Is that the expectation that there will be?
I think they're going
to
do a third one. Oh, actually, so I think that there's technically just like no word. So the actual developers have neither confirmed nor denied.
So, as much as you'd like this to be a Last of Us podcast, this is not a Last of Us podcast. But like I said, there is a connection to, and not even just the what do you want to say, the hallucinogenic element to it.
Did you? I don't want to keep talking about. I'm sure our corporate overlords are like, what are these guys talking about? But have you ever heard the theory of like there are some people out there who have weird ideas about what the Bible talks about, and there is one theory. There is one theory that the fruit from the tree that Adam and Eve, the knowledge of good and evil, is actually a reference to hallucinogenic mushrooms. And that it was actually their eyes were opened through the experience.
This might be another example of like when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But actually, I thought you were going to bring up the example of, because I've also heard it in reference to the burning bush, that there's a hallucinogenic element to Moses' conversation with God as well.
Yeah, that would be something else. Actually, so to actually get away from being kind of jokey about this and a little bit more serious, this is gonna be a weird episode, I guess. But there's like a really big uptick in hallucinogens being used, right, within culture, right? And there's some things happening within therapeutic circles where there's this idea of like micro dosing things is helping people and being therapeutic. And I don't have much to say
No,
about
and that's
that.
not
I'll
going to be
let
the point of this episode
doctors
either.
continue
So
to-
if you're
yeah.
planning on turning it off because of
Um,
that, or you're still listening because of that, I guess now you can be fully informed one way or
we're
the
not
other.
doing
Yeah.
This is not a hallucinogen
No.
episode. But the reason why I bring that up in a more serious manner is that people are being really loosey-goosey with this idea that, oh, hallucinogens are just like good for you, I guess,
Mhm.
right? And it's like, that's like spirit realm demon stuff, folks. You should be kind of cautious about just this
Yeah.
open-handed acceptance, invitation of it's kind of like just, hey, did you find we just discovered that Ouija boards are really good for your mental health, and all of a sudden everyone's just like using Ouija boards or something like
Well,
that.
it's almost
Like,
like in the
I
same way
would
that
be very
you
hesitant.
almost want to like, and ironically, I'm usually the one that maybe in my effort to reach out too much could be accused of this, but it's almost like you're trying too hard to baptize these like pagan things. And it's one thing for it to baptize a pagan thing, but it's another thing to try to almost like reconcile or baptize a overtly anti-Christian, like demonic thing, right? Whether we're talking like,
Yes, that could be. And again, if whatever we're talking about some kind of therapeutic application, I'm open-minded as far as that goes, but I don't get the impression that's how people are using these on the streets. And so let that be a PSA.
yeah,
That's
don't,
because I do
just say
think they
no.
work.
This
I
is
do think they
Jacob's-
open.
This is Jacob's 1980s
they-
just say no speech that,
Yes.
so talking about,
okay, whatever. Let's talk about
so,
trees.
and again, why we kind of went down that little bit of a rabbit trail is because, so one of the things that this very popular nonfiction book called The Hidden Life of Trees, did you ever read that one or come across that one? It's just,
I don't think I've read it. It actually sounds really familiar.
yeah,
though.
I mean, it's,
where have I heard of it?
I think it was a New York Times
Just a popular
bestseller,
book, I
which
guess?
I think on the surface was maybe significant that it's like, oh, you mean a book about trees that everybody wants to buy or wants to read or whatever. It was like he was like a forest ranger, environmentalist who I mean, studied it, but the author's name is
When did it
escaping
come
me.
out? Like, what era are we talking about?
This is, I mean, I want to say within the last 20 years. This isn't like in the 70s or anything.
Relatively
Yeah,
recent then. Okay.
But and I think one of the parts of the appeal is just like I've said, trees have had such a role in just human consciousness, and not just spiritual or religious consciousness, but it's been present. I mean, there's always, and this is why, but in our mythology and all of our stories, and we're just surrounded by them. And maybe it's because we're less and less surrounded by them, right? If so many people are growing up in more of an urban environment, we're fascinated by them because they are not as, I guess, common to our experience as we'd like them to be. But sorry, go ahead.
I've literally made large life decisions based upon proximity to treuse.
Yeah.
So when I was leaving the military, we were in Hawaii, and it's really hard to house hunt and plan to move back to the continents when you have this 8-hour flight minimum. And so a lot of it was being done over the internet. But one of the wickets that we had to check for wherever we were going to move back to, because we didn't have strong roots in any
Nice.
one location.
No pun
we just
intended.
had kind of a geographic. No pun intended. Yeah. But one of the things that I insisted upon, my wife was happy to agree to, was it had to be a naturally beautiful geographic region of the world. And where we live is
That's
that.
I mean, that's one of the
And,
most common things you'll hear from outsiders, right? Because we both live, I mean,
And that
we
kind of
live in the
means
same
and
area,
honestly,
so,
in my own
yeah.
mind, what that meant was like trees, right? Not that I don't think there's beauty to the desert and there's beauty to like the plains and things like that. I get it, but I think forests are kind of like
you
what I
and
love.
and you
So-
just wanted to feel more Tolkien, right? In sharing that affinity. So that's, I mean, obviously
That's
that's a nonfiction example. That's a nonfiction book, but I wanted to kind of use that to tie into. And you mentioned, we have this connection with trees and beauty, but I think it has this idea of there's a connection between trees and life, and not just the fact that there's a tree
Yep.
called the tree of life in the Bible, because that didn't happen by accident. That wasn't, random, but that trees have always had that connotation. And I don't just mean the life of the tree itself, but they become the sort of like facilitator of life. And so that's going to be one of the mythological connections that we're going to talk about. But there's some other ones too. Are you like just in mythology, like where else do you see trees or what are the kind of thematic elements connected to?
Yeah, is this the part of the episode where we just start rattling off kind of like where we've seen these before?
Well, you could, yeah.
The biggest one, I mean, the one. All right, this is another another kind of ubiquitous theme, right? But one of my personal favorites is Yggdrasil.
Okay, yeah, Norse mythology.
The cosmic tree in Norse mythology.
Well, and that's
right?
kind of the sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think that's actually a really interesting mythology that has a big tree at the center of it. Again, no pun intended. Because it literally is like the center of the universe, and all the different worlds that inhabitants live in are either in its branches or in its roots. Which is I just kind of like that. When they did that in Thor, the first movie, and he was describing the universe to Jane Foster, and they turned it into this kind of like literally this kind of cosmic tree where like the stars and like the veins of galaxies kind of like make the shape.
I can kind of picture that scene too. Well, and there again, what are the two things that you're kind of describing? You're talking about the different habitats, right? That's what Yggdrasil kind of facilitated or whatever. But then it also created a sense of network, right? That they were all connected by this tree.
True.
And so it's not only representing life, but it's representing connection. And so that's the and again, just kind of go back to that Hidden Life of Trees book. Those are two of the big points that the author will make, is that it's this.
Was he kind of pointing out like they really are alive? Like they have like because I think people are kind of talking more and more like that.
Yeah.
Where people are appreciating like the souls that plants have, which is a classical Christian concept, right? We don't think that souls are just something that
soul just comes from the word anima, which means alive. And so anything that's alive technically has a soul, even living, if it's not a rational soul, right? Which is one of the things that would distinguish humans from other sentient animals, and then animals from plants. If you go back to your Aristotle's psychology sort of thing.
Yes.
So yeah, no, that is one of the points. And actually, because we don't want to go down this rabbit trail too far either, but even if you think in terms of, usually we think of like sentient or non-sentient as if it's like this kind of like dichotomy, as opposed to what if it's more of a spectrum where you go from less to more sentient, and then what if different living things, because they already have this nature of life in terms of having a soul. Well, what if the concept of, nutrition, which usually distinguishes just the plant soul or vegetative soul, and then the sentience or consciousness, which distinguishes the animal soul. What if it's not so much, like I said, a dichotomous thing, but it's more of a spectrum thing? But that's not, that's one area that I think is yeah, go ahead.
Well, let me add to that and really put a theological flavor on it. Because I totally agree with you. And I do think that, the problem is, here's the thing. So much about like what happened with the history of science is that it came in with this like hyper triumphantalism, and it threw out all the knowledge that existed prior to, and is now kind of coming full circle and coming back to concepts, because it threw it out, started from scratch, did a lot of good things. I'm not saying it didn't, but it is having to acknowledge, in my mind, areas where it's discovering kind of certain truths or implications, at least, that were already well established in pre-Enlightenment times, let's say. And one of those things is the idea that consciousness is this kind of like ever-present thing going on, and that souls are something of a spectrum, right? And what I will say is that even as Christians, even as humans, that what it means to be a fallen human is there's something different about the juxtaposition with that with an unfallen human.
Well,
and or a theified human as we continue on our road towards salvation. And it's us just climbing the spectrum of our soul, right? We're becoming more
So you're kind of
human.
referring to
We're
in the
becoming
medieval period or the scholastic, they talk about the great chain of being, right? Which actually goes back to
Mhm.
Aristotle and the ancients too. But it's funny you mention the divides, the sharp divides, which you're saying is the product of
because that's this kind of categorization. Yeah, this kind of like uh this scientific
well,
kind of what's the word I want to use? They tend to do this. You got
the
to
hard
categorize
sciences
things,
got too
right?
hard
Like,
basically, right? Because they divide but
yeah,
no, it's interesting you describe it in that context because not only do we have the presence of a tree in the garden story, right, in the Garden of Eden story, not only do we have the presence of a tree being the kind of vehicle for the fall, right, if you think in terms of it was the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but we also think of, okay, the product of original sin, the sin of wasn't just that they were cut off from God, it's that they were cut off from each other, but that they were also cut off from the rest of creation. And so when you talk about these sharp divides between, humans and non-rational animals, or humans and vegetables and plants, is that also again, not trying to conflate the two. It's not saying that the two are the same. It's saying that we have such a distance between us and the rest of creation, including non-rational animals and plants, and it's ultimately due to sin, right? I mean, if you just want to, the easy answer is just every bad thing is due to sin ultimately, but
Well, I do think there is this I don't know if you want to use that language or not. It's like it's almost like a zoological difference between fallen humanity and unfallen humanity, like what Adam and Eve were in the
Mhm.
garden. We are still fundamentally the same creature, right? We are humans.
No,
That is what we are, and
it's
that's
a
what Jesus
fallen and
became.
unfallen
But
nature, not that we change nature. It's not that we are, it's not a total
yeah, but
depravity
there's
sort of
something
idea that you
very
see in, basically
right.
whatever, Calvinism and stuff. But
And it's interesting, the garden is one of my favorite symbols
Mhm.
because it means like a walled space where you cultivate.
Paradise, yeah, paradise means walled.
Okay, yeah, I knew I was getting that from somewhere. And that's what like if you look at what God did according to the story of Genesis, is he created a place where he would meet with humans in this sanctuary, this temple structure that is basically a nature
Mhm.
preserve, right? It's like we are meant to live amongst the trees with the animals in communion with God. It's this very not to denigrate it because I'm not, but it's almost like this kind of hippie existence, right? Where like we are, and I don't think it's a hippie existence. I'm just being
Everything
jokey
the
there.
hippies
But
got
like
right is what you're saying.
yeah, well, anything that was good about what they were going for is their heart yearning for this Garden of Eden paradise that
Well,
we were
and the
built
last
for.
theme actually, besides life and connection, that I really wanted to talk about in terms of what do we see trees representing, is they also represent wisdom. And so we have this not from Greek mythology first, which I hadn't actually, until I was starting to research for this, I hadn't come across this story, or I didn't remember this story, but it was actually the reason why it's called Athens, Greece. So obviously you can recognize that it comes from Athena, right? So
Yeah,
so
sure,
the
sure.
people of what came to be called Athens, it was like they were deciding what they were going to name their city after, and it was basically between Athena and Poseidon, and based off of the gift that was given, that's who they were going to choose. And now I can't even remember what Poseidon's gift was, but I know Athena. What did she give?
I bet it was like
It's water
water
based. Yeah, really swung for the
or
fences on that one.
something. Yeah, whatever.
So she plants an olive tree as a gift for the people. And so, but what
Mm.
is Athena? She's the goddess of wisdom, right? And so
Yeah,
so
for
there
sure.
we have Athena. What does she do as her wise move, which actually gets her this honor, is planting a tree. And I've, we think of like ancient Greek culture, or whatever. You
That's
have
very
the olive
interesting.
tree too.
No, I see what's happening
But
there.
not only does it associated
Uh-huh.
with kind of the pagan mythology, but even in Buddhism, where does the Buddha attain
Oh yeah, the
enlightenment?
Bodhi
Yeah,
tree.
exactly. And so you have
The Bodhi tree.
now
Yeah.
take it a step further, because not only does it apply to our ancient mythology or to our Eastern religion like Buddhism, but in our secular mythology, where does Isaac Newton attain wisdom or enlightenment? It's under the of gravity, right?
Oh, that's
It's
so
under the tree.
funny.
It's under
Yeah,
the
the
apple
apple
tree or
falls on his.
whatever.
You did a good
Didn't
job on
yeah,
this
right?
one,
I
Mike.
told you I've been looking forward
Look
to
at
this.
you. These are clever
So,
examples. I like these
well,
examples.
especially
Unexpected.
the secular mythology of Isaac, like we tell that story over and over.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because it's literally an apple, right? In the Garden of
Mm.
Eden, they
And
eat
it's
the
of
apple
knowledge,
kind of thing.
which is probably what factored into the story, right? If we're thinking it's like chopping down the cherry tree. I mean,
Chopping down the
it's
cherry tree by George
but now it's the
Washington.
apple tree because
Well,
it's wisdom, right? Or knowledge.
you know, and it's so like trees have always played such an important role in human culture, right? And I use that language culture specifically because I mean it as a synonym for civilization.
Mhm.
Prior to settling down in towns and things like that, you're kind of like migrating hunter-gatherer types. When you create towns, depending upon where you're at, you're using different resources. But certainly some towns were using wood. And obviously, a tree is one of the most resourceful items that
Mhm.
humans have for just about anything we do. To this day, we are building our houses out of wood structures, even if they get, other material applied to the outside of those structures. Um, trees are ever essential to our ability to continue to just
Mm.
build, right? Just as such. And I think that goes back to the cultivating layer of our human calling, right? Like our created human calling is just to be working with
Well,
trees.
and the fact that they're
Um,
so you kind of mentioned they're so resourceful, like every part of it can and often does get used. What's another kind of secular myth that we probably both remember hearing growing up? But the giving tree, the Shel Silverstein giving tree, right?
uh, that's a really good challenging book. That's a type of book that has a mythic quality
Absolutely,
to it
yeah.
because it's a like a hard to understand
Mhm.
parable. And at the end of the day, it's like because especially when you're a child, everything is just a moral
Yeah.
lesson, right? Every story you ever read when, for the first like 5 years of your life, there's some kind of moral to the story. There's some kind of lesson you're supposed to take away from it that's kind of black and
Mhm.
white, like don't steal, don't push your brother, blah, blah, blah. The Giving Tree is like one of the first books I was introduced to at a really young age that I didn't know what the
Doesn't have
lesson
that
was.
satisfying like
Yeah, I understood that the tree took care of the boy and loved the boy, but the boy doesn't make good choices as far as the tree goes. He doesn't kind of reciprocate. The tree doesn't win
Mhm.
in the end, except for the fact that eventually there's this sense of reconciliation that occurs when the tree is now just a stump and the boy finally comes back as an old man and sits on him. And as a child, it was very hard for me to like understand what I was supposed to take away from that story, and I just knew that it kinda made me sad,
Mm.
right? Like, it was like a sad story. Um, but there was also this kind of, like, hopeful elements when it came to, like, the old man comes back to
And the
sit on the
parent
stump at
reading it
the
to you
end.
says, "See, kids, you're the person, and I'm the tree, and you just keep taking and taking and taking until I'm dead." Is I thought that was the more that was the takeaway. Is
I don't think I made that connection when I was a kid. But certainly yeah, what it's like, and someone should have like said, this is why you should love your parents. Now that I have teenagers and sometimes they, kind of don't think through the amount that they're provided,
Mhm.
right? That they're given. So now you've inspired me to give them the
Yeah.
Giving Tree.
You're
I'm
gonna
gonna sit down. I'm
read to
gonna put
him.
my 14 and 15-year-old on my knee, and we're gonna read the Giving Tree and
I'm sure they'll be really receptive
have
to
a
that.
conversation.
Yeah. So, not only does it
How come they haven't turned that into an animated movie yet?
I
Where's
wanna
my
see the
Giving
dark, gritty
Tree?
retelling of the Giving Tree.
Oh
Yeah.
boy. Hey, while we're talking about children's stories about trees, did you ever read the one? This was a pretty popular one. It's basically a Christmas story. Which maybe this whole episode should have been a Christmas themed episode and we could talk about Christmas trees.
Nah.
But like nah. Um but there's an episode or there's a story where there's three trees and they get cut down and used for different purposes. And the one tree gets turned into a ship, one tree gets turned into a treasure chest. And it's all about from the perspective of the trees, and the trees are hopeful that they're going to get turned into something that becomes very important and all that. So
I
do
don't,
you not
but I can
recognize
see where
this
it's
yet?
going. Yeah.
You see where it's
I mean,
going? Especially because I already let the cat out of the bag that it's a
Sure.
Christmas episode or a Christmas story. Well, the final tree gets turned into a lowly manger,
Oh.
Mike. And he's like, oh, man, my
Bunch
brother
of
tree
animals
got
are
turned
gonna
into a
eat,
ship. Yeah, my other tree friend got turned into like a treasure chest or whatever he gets turned into. And I'm just a thing for animals to eat
So you
food out
remember
of.
remember how
Shucks.
we were talking before, the connection between Christmas and Easter? So there's actually another example of this, of basically the exact same theme that you were describing, of different trees in a forest, and there was this proud tree that talked about how, how many leaves he had or how tall he was or how many branches or whatever. And so he, again, this very proud tree, but then he eventually gets cut down, and it's a very humbling experience because but what does he get turned into? He becomes the tree, an execution tree, right? He becomes the tree of the cross, which at first
the tree of the
is,
cross.
again, a very humiliating thing. He doesn't understand what's going on. And then of course he, sees it for what it is. And that's the big lesson at the end of it too. So.
Well, I think that, and I'm just never sure. Like, I know that's going to be a huge element of this conversation, and I want to make it a huge element of this conversation. Is the symbolism of
The tree of life, the new tree of life,
as it becomes cross, yeah, right. And so I think that'll become this really dominant conversation. But before we get to it, like I'm enjoying this kind of like review
going back
of
to our
different
childhood.
things. And honestly, I can't remember. It kind of makes me wonder because your whole like one tree gets turned into a cross thing. It's like, is that the same story I'm talking about?
You just turned
I
it
don't
into a
remember
Christmas
anymore. I'm gonna have to
story because
revisit
you're
that.
super sentimental.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I don't remember the seeing what his other trees get turned into, like the ship and the other stuff.
One gets turned into a ship. I know there's a story where there's different trees.
No, they very well could be two different ones. And yeah.
They might be two different stories.
Which kind of brings us to, so we were going to talk about, like, obviously, just like so many trees are used in other mythologies, we have so many trees throughout the entire Bible. We've talked very briefly on the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil in Eden, which you've also mentioned is a paradise, which comes from the word for walled garden. And so there again, even the concept of Eden itself implies vegetative life, implies trees, and that there's a protection or a cultivation, a culture that is being developed with these two, which actually we've so I mentioned Buddhism, but in Hinduism, there's another concept of this paradise or walled garden called Indra, which is actually going to play into later in our conversation too, the concept of Indra. So what other
I look forward to that because I haven't heard that before.
And the way that it's applied in like kind of the more modern example I'm thinking of is not the direct connection. But so what other, like, can you think of what are the other trees? You mentioned the cross already, so that kind of brings us up to that kind of brings us full circle. But
we'll
in between there, we have some trees that show up in the Bible as well.
Well, yeah, let's see here. What else? What other trees are there in the Bible? There's the in the Psalms, they talk about the trees of Lebanon, right? And that's kind of a euphemism for strong, sturdy, like it's usually a good thing. What am I missing? What are you talking about? What's the obvious story
so
that I'm
there's
forgetting?
we talked a lot about,
or how about this one? David's son getting his
Absalom,
hair caught
right?
in a tree
Absalom,
branch.
I think is the one.
Absalom,
who dies in the
the trees
again,
get him.
Hanging from a tree is certainly a concept that's very familiar. Not just again, we haven't even gotten into the whole crucifixion part, but hanging from a tree is very much an execution method. That's always been around. I was thinking,
and cursed is anyone who is hung from a tree.
So, even cursing in trees, maybe will come up too, right? When we talk about Jesus, cursing a tree like with Jonah, right at the end of the.
Oh, how Jesus. You're talking about in the gospel?
Well, there's cursing the fig tree that Jesus does right outside Jerusalem, right? But then even
Sure,
before
sure.
that,
Yeah,
one of the most mythological stories, and we've talked about the Jonah story in regards to the descent into the underworld.
Oh
But
yeah.
if you go past that,
We just talked about
he
all that.
emerges from the
Mhm.
from the underworld, from Sheol, goes to Nineveh, makes the prophetic announcement: the people of Nineveh repent, God spares the city. But Jonah is stuck under this fig tree right at the end of the story.
Yeah. And he is quite
Yeah.
upset because all those bad. And admittedly, one of the things that gets glossed over in Sunday school is just how bad the Ninevites
Yeah.
were. Just how in need of repentance that culture needed to get to. They were brutal. They were brutal pillagers and rapists and child sacrificers. They were all of the very bad, not good things that you think of with ancient pagan cultures. And so he is rather upset
So
that
his dislike
they're
was
not going to
somewhat
get wiped
justified,
out.
is what you're a Jonah apologist.
He had
Yeah.
his reasons. He had his
So
reasons.
basically, he was right for disobeying God. Is that what you're saying, Jacob? Because that's what I'm hearing. Is
you have to break a few eggs to wipe out Ninevites.
that's
all I know.
That sounds like the general use of that phrase. That sounds familiar. Yeah. So, but there again, why it's so significant? For one, it's a miraculous tree, which already should have your head firing in terms of like spiritual significance, because it grows up overnight. Wasn't that the thing? But then
that's true.
it gets destroyed overnight as well. And so, and that's where, that's where it kind of, it prompts this conversation between Jonah and God, because that's where the whole, you're sad about this tree being destroyed, but you wanted me to destroy an entire city.
Right. And well, it's interesting how the God is basically calling the city a tree, right? Like what you were saying, and that kind of goes back to how our relationship with civilization and culture as such is, pun intended, rooted in our relationship with trees and with the gardens and things like that.
Comparing
The symbolism
a
is very
city
real.
to a tree, or a culture to a tree, does that have any New Testament significance when we go into, again, we've already brought up, but Jesus and the fig tree, just as he's lamenting Jerusalem, right? It's also playing that similar role. And
yes, it is. And also, when he is talking about faith as a mustard seed turning into a tree that all the birds come and nest in, right? So that's another symbol of the church, and how all the people are going to come nest in it and things like that.
Yeah,
so
I think
it's
the
like
church
a
fathers
motif.
use that as sort of like not just the church, but then also like the Gentiles being brought in,
like the birds and things like that. That's what I was getting at, Mike.
No, this is a conversation.
I thought our audience was.
This is a conversation. So,
all right.
Yeah, I mean, so then, well, and actually, I was saying before how one of the other things about trees representing wisdom. So that actually, not only do we see that in pagan mythology, like I said with the Athena example, but that's actually one of the Proverbs. In Proverbs 3, wisdom is compared to a tree, or seen in light of a tree. And so,
see that.
And so
I feel like I was reading like the Book of Enoch, and so the Book of Enoch gets into trees. Like the Book of Enoch talks about trees. It's basically talking about
a little
trees
bit of a background. So
in the same
Book
way
of
like
Enoch
the garden
is a would you not deuterocanonical? It's not
Second
Temple. But it's a apocryphal, or what would you say? Like
yes,
it's not part of the Christian.
It's not
canon.
in a Bible, unless it's in the Ethiopian Christian
Okay.
Bible though. So there's actually the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees are, if you want to find the Christian denomination that has the most robust collection of books in its biblical library, it's the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And my Eastern Orthodox Church is a close second, but they have us beat because they include the Book of Enoch.
We were talking about how like the consciousness is not so much a dichotomy, but a spectrum. And so same with the biblical canon. It's not a dichotomy between Protestant and Catholic. It's a spectrum between, Protestant on one end, and then you go all the way to the Ethiopian Orthodox canon.
They're on the far end. They're the radicals. They're radical Bibles with all their books in it. But
radical coming from the term to the root, by the way. Yeah. But sorry, keep
Ooh,
going.
man, this is a great episode. So they actually, and that goes into how like the canons are formed and things like that. We should understand that what formed these canons was their use in the liturgical cycle. And so it's a no small thing that the Ethiopians have these books in their canon. It's not like they just said, "Hey, we like this book, we're going to use it." Like it was like created in some kind of council, which is the misconception people have. It's that councils uh um under what's the word I'm looking for? They affirmed what
Oh,
people
yeah,
were
okay.
already
Yep.
using, right? They recognized, that's what it is. That's that obvious word I just couldn't figure out for some reason. A council would just recognize and accept what was common knowledge to everybody. And in those African circles down there where that church was existing, they were widely using these books in their worship services. And even though we're in schism with them today, it's not over their use of those
Well,
books, and so it's interesting that there's clearly that's almost like a liminal
and yeah,
text
going
in
back
my
to your
own
original
eyes,
point of
but
bringing up the Book of Enoch, regardless of whether it's accepted in whatever your faith tradition's canon is, it still is a good window into the kind of historical practice of Christians, or this would be Second Temple Jewish. So like, what would have been very influential to the early Christians anyway, right? It's kind of like what we were talking about with the
right.
proto-evangelium of James, where it's not included
Yep.
in the
Yep.
New Testament canon, but it's been very influential for Orthodox and Catholic, the liturgical year, right? A lot of our feast days are based off of stuff from
Sure.
that. And so you can use the same understanding or same relationship to the Book of Enoch as well. But sorry, go ahead and they were talking about trees in that one.
Well, and yeah, so there's trees that are brought up in it. I'm just trying to remember. Frankly, I derailed my train of thought by going into how canons were created, but or how scriptures were canonized. Um, what was it that I was? Why
Well,
did I
because
go to Enoch? He talks
I
about
mentioned that
trees. It
Proverbs talks
was
about wisdom, or trees as a symbol for wisdom. And then you
a
brought
symbol
up
for
Book of
wisdom.
Enoch.
I maybe
Well,
that's where I was going then, because he does talk about trees and he does talk about them being in these spaces where God is and
and
things
one
like
of those
that.
spaces would have been the temple itself. Because what's the tree or the symbol of a tree that we would have seen in the temple and actually in the tabernacle beforehand? What's that Jewish structure or Jewish symbol that is representative of a tree or the burning bush?
Well, are you
The
answer that
menorah.
question because I don't.
The menorah is
Oh, okay,
representative
okay,
of
okay.
it's
You want to know why I wanted you? Because I was like, are you talking about like the Sephiroth tree? Like my head went to like medieval rabbinic
I was trying to
Judaism.
lob it over the plate. See, you don't have the
I
outline in front of you,
sometimes
so
I'm not even in the batter
yeah.
box. Sometimes I'm still over there just like kicking my shoes with the bat, um, chewing bubble gum. Go
So
on. All right, the
yeah,
menorah. There you
so
go. Yeah, that's
that was
fun.
supposed to be, especially with the candles at the ends of it was representative of the burning bush,
Sure, sure.
which actually it talks about that as a symbol for wisdom in the Talmud, which again would have been.
Do we still have a menorah on our altars in the Orthodox Church? Does the Catholic Church has it
So
retained
you
that
won't
practice?
see,
I
yeah.
honestly,
So you'll see the candles like the 3 and 3 on each side, which is kind of comes from the Book of Revelation because Jesus emerges between those. But you won't
mhm,
see, and you will see as kind of ornamental pieces in some Catholic churches, like maybe on the altarpiece or maybe in the maybe in like the stained glass or something. But it's not like in
okay,
every Catholic sanctuary or on every Catholic altar you'll see it, but you'll see it
okay,
more. Like I said, um, the lampstands or the candles will be on either side of the altar or around the tabernacle, or something like that. So.
okay.
Yeah, I think our
That's cool though.
local,
That's a good.
the Viterbo, I think where you went to school, I think in their
Yeah,
chapel,
the Sisters of Perpetual
I think
Adoration.
they have an image of it somewhere, but I can't remember. I can't think of it off the top of my head. So
That is a drop dead gorgeous chapel, by
yeah,
the way. I believe it's called the Chapel of Angels or
yeah,
something
Mary
like
of the
that.
Angels.
It's oh, okay. But there's like 100 angels like in it. Like it's decorated in a way where there's kind of like angels hidden
There's
everywhere, so you can kind of like
there's
scavenger hunt all
a
the
ton
angel
of artwork.
depictions.
Yeah, tons of artwork in that one.
It's very pretty. It's really nice. Yeah, it's also largely kind of it's all like kind of green marble, right? I believe it's painted. I don't think it's actually marble, but it's meant to. It's the aesthetic is of kind of like, if I'm not, it's actually been probably like a couple of years since I was in it, but it's very like green in there and it's columned and things like that. So it actually has this very kind of like foresty vibe for the context of this conversation. So if you're ever in La Crosse, Wisconsin, go visit the Chapel of Mary's Angels or whatever
Nice.
Mike said it was called.
So
it's very
well,
pretty.
and
I
that
love that
actually
church.
speaks to. So I mentioned, the menorah being in the temple. So actually, that there was supposed to be a lot of kind of decorative, creation elements, including vegetation, in the Jewish temple as well. Which there again, because it was supposed to
Sure.
be a sort of new Eden for the Israelites when they built the temple, is that it's like a return to Eden, and so it would also represent or resemble that walled garden um, atmosphere or setting as well.
Oh, and this is no mean thing either, because this is largely coming from cultures that had to deal with arid climates, right? And so the idea of oases, an oasis of, the idea that life and plant vegetation are synonymous. It's because literally the contrast is the wilderness of the arid desert, where things don't grow well and where life is not easily lived and things like that. And so decoration, like, if you look at vestments or if you look at banners and hangings and things like that, there's always that kind of filigree, which is the kind of like leafy, liney stuff that you recognize in like, medieval manuscripts, or any type of decoration, Victorian decoration. This idea that it's always vegetative. Filigree is basically just decorating things with plants, vines and leaves and things like that. It's just so innate to our souls, to the way that this created order exists, right? And I'll finish with Jordan Peterson talked about this at various points, where he would talk about how churches with their columns and with all the filigree, with all like the leafy decor being like kind of carved into the stone, right? Because filigree doesn't have to be just something that is, drawn onto a piece of paper. If you look at a Corinthian column, it's got the leafiness at the top of it. It's got the that type of a treatment.
Well, and it's that continuity between the early church and Judaism, where just like the temple was supposed to be a new Eden or a return to Eden, so too was supposed to be every church that was built. Every church was supposed to be, and I think of the monastic communities especially because one of the reasons why they were so intent on, I guess you could say, like doing yard work or whatever, is because they were supposed to because they were supposed to be a return to what was the command given to Adam, was to keep and to till the garden. And so they're
absolutely
sort of fulfilling that
if
role
you want to
as well.
One of my favorite images of this is a place called Mount Athos. It's in Greece. I've heard one person call this the Eastern Orthodox equivalent of the Vatican, because we don't have a centralized authority in the way that the Catholic Church does, but we do have the Holy Mountain, which is our euphemism for Mount Athos. It's a peninsula in Greece, but it basically, for historical reasons, it became an epicenter of monastic vitality. And so it's just this whole little country, because they actually are their own little country, kind of. I think they're subservient to Greece, but they
Just
are
like
their
the
own
Vatican, yeah.
kind of. Yeah, it is. It's like that. And they still fly. They still fly the Byzantine flag.
Oh, nice.
Like their flag is actually the flag of Eastern Rome. But anyway, it is, to my eyes, it is literally paradise on earth. And if you look at it, if you Google this, if you look at images of it, it is just a bunch of people cultivating the landscape. They built these amazing castle-like monasteries that are just surrounded with, groves and agrarian living. And it's like, wow, I bet you that's what heaven looks like. Because it just looks like that's what I bet you if man had never fallen, the whole world would just kind of look like that. And it's just obviously that's just me kind of being fanciful. Who knows? But
there's a tear rolling
it's
down
very
your
beautiful
eye right now. Nobody else can see it but me. It's his voice. He's trying to make sure his voice doesn't crack. But it sounds like he's making a pitch for the Voyage podcast pilgrimage site.
Yes. Hey, corporate overlords. I think I need to do some research for this podcast over at Mount Athos. So if you can bake that into the budget sometime soon, that'd be
gonna
cool.
have to sell a lot of Jonah comics for that. Hey, Finney,
pick up those Jonah comics. They're great.
Finney number 7 is out.
Yeah, there you go.
They climb a mountain on that one.
Hey, well, we're not talking about
we actually are going to have a
mountains.
mountain episode.
Mountains,
so,
we need to have a mountain episode now, so I can get paid to go to Mount Athos.
So where else? Actually, no. We had to come full circle because so not only do we see the tree of life, the tree of knowledge, right? Because that's again, the tree is supposed to not only be representative of life, representative of wisdom, but then of connection. And so what's the tree? Right? The tree of life that shows up in the New Testament, not just it actually isn't called this in the Gospels. It's in the book of Revelation. But what, from a Christian standpoint, is the tree of life now? And
cross,
so we eat, and
the cross of our
just
Lord.
like, Adam and Eve were given the fruit of the tree of life before they fell. Now, as Christians who have, returned into or have been reconciled or brought back into this right relationship, we now eat the fruit of the tree of life. And this is what...
Yeah, and let's remember, we talked about this at some other podcast point, but the fruit of the tree was never going to be forbidden forever. The idea is that they would eventually be allowed
just to clarify,
to eat it.
Because we were talking about the tree of life at first.
True. Well, so anyway, the idea is that the cross, like what you're saying, has taken the place, and so now we eat of its fruit, right? In my tradition, as we go through Lent, the midweek, 6 weeks, the third one is we commemorate the cross, and it's we do that obviously on Good Friday as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a special Sunday for the cross because it's a tree in the desert. Like the idea, the language that's used is that we rest under its shade as
like
we go through. Yeah, absolutely. As we go through the desert of Lent, we take solace in the shade of the cross, understanding like the fruit of it, in our lives and things like that. And
and just because we haven't spelled this out, but in the ancient Christian tradition, the church fathers referred to the Eucharist as the fruit of the tree of life. So just like Jesus hung from the cross and the fruit hangs from the tree, so now we, participate in the body of Christ, which hung from the cross or hung from the new tree of life. And so you'll see, this image has been present from the beginning of Christianity, not just in the book of Revelation, but you see some of the, I think the Church of San Clemente in Rome, this is where you get the mosaic of it's Jesus on the cross, but what is sort of like branching out from the cross are these vines that have included all the different, like you could say, types of Christians. And so you'll have like the monk over here, or you'll have the queen over here, or the peasant over here. But like all of these people have now been grafted onto the vine, right? But it starts from, or it originates from the tree of life and the cross, and then Jesus, of course, at the center.
It's also, St. Paul uses that language obviously in Romans when he's talking about the Gentile Christians being grafted onto the tree of the church, right? Onto the tree of Israel, right? But again, this idea that the tree of life is the cross, and that the cross, it's not arbitrary. Jesus's death by means of crucifixion, it's like, well, couldn't Jesus have just been poisoned to death,
or beheaded,
couldn't Jesus have just beheaded or something like that, right?
That would have really
And I
hurt
mean, I
the
don't know.
symbolism of
Theoretically, I
the
guess.
head in the body of the church, though. That's the thing, right? God's a better artist
Yikes,
than
right?
that. So
Well, and it also, what I want to say is that symbolism like matters,
Mhm.
right? That it's not arbitrary. We really have this kind of preconception in our heads as modern people, I believe, that symbolism is just this kind of like whatever, useful heuristic maybe, but it's not meaningful. It's not um, essential, right? But I think that a proper understanding of our place in the cosmos and how we live our lives needs to reinvigorate our concept that these symbols are essential to how the universe is and how we understand God. When when I say understand God, I mean to say like how we
well,
meet
and if
him,
we really want to see,
and we
if we
meet
really
him
want to
through the cross
respect
and
the
through a tree.
concept of providence, right, or seeing God as Jesus as the Lord of history, then yeah, from our perspective, looking back, it'd be like, oh, wasn't it convenient that this happened the way that this happened, the way that this happened? But if you're the
Yeah,
one plotting
right.
out if you're the one writing the story, then it's not convenient at all. It's very
Yeah.
much essential. And so it's
Yeah,
giving.
no, it's a tree because he's going to be crucified. He's the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, right? And I think this is a little timey-wimey, right? So whatever, take it with a grain of salt. But I kind of think that history starts at the cross. Like history, or maybe the incarnation, whatever, the whole process, the 33-year moment. And that it is working backwards from that moment. Like if you're looking at the prehistory of it, and it's working forwards from that moment if you're in our time. But when the Bible says a thing like he's the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, I kind of take it literally. I kind of take it to mean that like God begins creation at the cross, and everything. And again, I think that gets timey-wimey, right? And so go ahead and reject it if you wish, because if it's not helpful, then
Well, yeah,
don't worry
even
about
if
it.
I
But
would say at the very least, it works on the level of metaphor, but I know you're trying to go beyond that. I don't want to reduce what you're saying, but if nothing else,
sure,
that is the
I'm not convinced that I'm right
No.
on it, right? So I could. That's
No,
what
and I
I
don't
want
wanna
to
give a
say
whole
is I am going for
yeah,
more than
I don't want to give a
metaphor,
ton of
but I
pushback on it
also
either because it's not really the
yeah, I don't want to say
Um,
that it's 100% true. I don't know. It's just something I kind of
well, and but
suspect.
even just because again, if the whole idea of go back to we were talking about the book of Revelation, if and I know we assumed this going into the conversation, but like if you take the general historic understanding of the book of Revelation was John was on this island of Patmos having some vision of heaven, then his vision of these things, including this new tree of life and eating the fruit of the tree of life, is very much outside of time. And yeah, he's communicating it, in history in his particular moment in time using words that we can understand. Of course, writing in English as he's wont to do. And yeah,
King James English,
and
no less.
and but again, we have to also like even though it's helpful for us to kind of read it in the moment that we're living in history or whatever, looking back on it, right, using that because we're very
Yep.
imminent, we're very conditioned by time. If we really are going to take the writing at its word that he's having this vision of heaven, then it very much is outside of time. And so kind of to your point, and like you said, I mean, it's not going to be a hill that either of us are going to die on, at least at this moment, right? But at least on the level
Feel free
of
to correct
at least
me.
on the level of metaphor, you can see the kind of the symbolic significance.
So we've gone over all these different kind of elements of trees and things like that, and we haven't even gotten into the idea that there's basically like avatar characters for trees as such. I'm thinking things like Ents. I'm thinking things
Groot.
like whatever, Swamp Thing or Groot. Yeah, Groot's
Well,
perfect
and actually,
example, right?
oh
So
yeah, sorry.
go on.
No, so
No, go on.
all the themes that we were just talking about, like in the ancient mythologies, representing life, representing connection, representing wisdom, we can see how they are played out in these actual personifications. Is that, sorry to interrupt, is that what,
No, that's exactly. It's like we'll have to do an episode just on the kind of personification. Last time we were talking about how death is either a place or a person, depending upon the context of the myth
Yeah.
that you're reading and things like that. And you could say the same thing about
Well, and
trees,
what's cool
right?
is
And so
just like we've already tied in so many of these biblical examples, and we like you were saying, like we've tied in, when we talk about Jesus conquering death, it's like we've personified it in our Christian theology too. So what are the ways that these personifications of trees, as they're played out in ancient mythology, like we've already kind of discussed, as they're played out in the kind of more modern mythology of like the pop culture examples that you were mentioning. We also have like Game of Thrones. Brave New World has a cool one.
Oh yeah,
The
like the
Chronicles
old
of
gods.
Narnia.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis has a bunch of stuff about trees. It's not just Tolkien anymore, right? And so
Mhm, mhm.
all of these things.
Speaking of Avatar, there's
yeah.
that world tree
The
or whatever it's
soul
called.
tree, I think.
Spirit,
It's the center
spirit,
of the world
soul
in
tree.
Avatar, right? It's like
That's funny. That's called the soul tree. Yeah, they all tie into it.
connection.
Which
right?
really,
Connection
let's
and
talk
life.
about like it's like we're getting grafted
Well,
into
hey,
it.
let's save
right?
that enthusiasm for. So yeah, like Jacob said, we're gonna make this a whole conversation because we want to tie in a lot of the stuff we've already talked about, but yeah, really get into a lot of these pop culture references that we have seen so much of just in watching movies, TV shows, things like that too. So we hope that you guys can join us for that conversation. We appreciate you guys coming for this one, and I just want to remind you guys or encourage you guys to like, subscribe to the show, give that 5-star rating, leave a positive review, and so that you can show, just like Jacob had to prove that he still cared about the trees, that you guys, speak for the trees, right? You speak for the trees.
There's another Avatar.
Speak
All
for
right,
the
we'll talk about the Avatar of the
All right,
Lorax next
sounds
time
good.
too.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.